Does it change?
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Our speaker this morning is Bill Hoesch, and he is director of the Mount St. Helens Creation Center, which is just roughly an hour from here if you've never been there. It's exit 49 along I-5 in Washington. Bill received a bachelor's degree in geology from the University of Colorado and a master's in science from the Institute for Creation Research Graduate School. That was at that time in San Diego. Bill served for 17 years at the Institute for Creation Research. He has been an educator ever since, including a year of missionary service in China and leading field adventures not just to Mount St. Helens, but to Grand Canyon and elsewhere. And we're very pleased to have Bill with us this morning.
Well, can you hear me okay? Yeah. All right. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. Thank you for coming out this morning. Our topic for today is, let's see if we can get it up here. Excuse me. Excuse me one moment. Title for today, we're calling it Great Sedimentary Particles I Have Known. All right? I'm going to expand your understanding of what sedimentary particles are. I'm a geologist, which means I'm a little bit weird, and that's okay. Let me encourage you, though, some of you are sitting far back, I encourage you to come up a little closer because I hope you can see all my slides and read some of the smaller font I'm using. And don't feel bad if you want to sit toward the rear because I know what it's like. If the speaker's a little weird, you might want to get up and leave, you know. That's okay. I'm not offended if you do that. You see, you just get up and go. Yeah. So I'm from the Mount St. Helens Creation Center, and I understand that there's a little competition this morning. There's a big missions conference in Portland this morning. And yesterday, a young man came. You know, we have divine appointments there almost every day when people come to that creation center. There was a young man came yesterday, and he was traveling from Oak Harbor on his way to Portland to attend that seminar, and he saw our sign on the freeway. He's driving on the freeway, sees Creation Center. He pulls in, he says, "What's this place all about?" He's a young man carrying a Bible with him. And I spent about 3 hours talking to him, and it was all well worth it because it was real discipleship, real apologetics. And so there's hardly a day goes by there when I don't have some meaningful conversation with somebody. That is a happening place down there. There is good information there to be gained. And anybody who feels like you've got a ministry in apologetics and you'd like to volunteer a day a week, 1 day a week, or 1 day a month, or what have you, let's talk, because it's a ministry. It really is. And so we had answers that we could give to that young man, and he's probably going to go to the mission field himself. Anyway, so that's great. So our topic today is great sedimentary particles I have known. And we have an extraordinary sedimentary rock record on the earth, and Mount St. Helens is a perfect opportunity, a perfect open door for talking about earth history. A volcano, talking about a volcano is kind of stupid, but if you can talk about eternal things connected to it, then you've got something to say. And I think that Mount St. Helens is that way. Was there really prehistoric age of reptiles? Is there really a record on the earth of millions and hundreds of millions of years? Those kind of questions are really watershed issues for Christians, and it really divides the Christian community today and divides almost everybody. But I'd like to, I don't have all the answers on the on the mysteries of the sedimentary rock record, the fossils and so on. There's tons of mysteries. But what we do have is a record of extreme catastrophe. And that is what I'd like to bring out today. And so when we talk about well, what do I mean by sedimentary particles? Sedimentary particles, I have to disappoint people because Mount St. Helens was not, that valley you're looking at in the picture there is not lava. I disappoint people because there was no significant lava flow at Mount St. Helens at all. What you're looking at is a pile of sediment. In other words, it's mud, sand, silt, boulders, rocks, and other debris that landed to form that deposit. So at Mount St. Helens, there were 3 types of material that were deposited. There were mineral types, there were animal types, and there were, that's right, vegetable types. Animal, mineral, and vegetable. Those are 3 points I'd like to talk about. Because at Mount St. Helens, we had those things happening, and in the rock record, those are the extraordinary particles I want to talk about. And yeah. And when I think about Mount St. Helens, it's my first exposure to Mount St. Helens was 1984. And shortly after that, I began to realize that this is the best avenue for talking about Earth history with anybody. Because if you're like me and you like to talk to people about Christ, you bring up an idea with an unbeliever that, you see, the Earth is really quite young and there was a global flood. You bring that up with most people who have any kind of science background, you know what kind of look you get? You get a look like, what planet are you from, man? You really believe that stuff? It's an extreme position compared to the world that we live in. And so I'd like to explore this a little bit. And I'd like to talk about the ancient rock record. And I like to use pictures of Grand Canyon for that, just because we got layer upon layer of sedimentary rock here. And I've been to Grand Canyon a lot, spent a lot of time there. And we see layer upon layer of sedimentary rock. And we can see there's sedimentary layers there. And we can also see there's rock underneath that we call basement rock. And that's the kind of foundation rock that North America is made of. And it's got layers of sediment resting on top of it that are 4,000 feet thick in Grand Canyon. And the boundary between those two is very plain to see. And that's the first thing I tell people when we go to Grand Canyon is look at that boundary. That's called the Great Unconformity. It is found not just in Grand Canyon, it's found worldwide. Grand Canyon just happens to be a nice exposure of it, but we've got an extraordinary rock record here of where the earth got scoured with some kind of high energy erosion event that scoured the earth flat and then piled on sediments like that, one upon another. And those sediments are not restricted to Grand Canyon either. They extend all across North America, and they extend to other continents as well. They're not identical, but they're easy to correlate worldwide. And so we have an extraordinary record here. That's what I want to just emphasize. And so the ancient rock record has challenged the greatest minds of science for centuries. It's made of sand, silt, mud. It's got marine fossils, primarily marine fossils in it. And you can go to places like Kansas and drill through those sedimentary layers, and sure enough, you'll penetrate the basement rocks underneath. You'll penetrate the Great Unconformity. And that's where you know, my first career was in the oil industry, and that's where you know you quit drilling, because you're not going to find any oil below that. And so what is the story with the, do we have a record of ancient worlds that were, you know, each layer represents a different environment and over millions of years? That's the question we want to look at. Here's a cutaway picture of Grand Canyon, layered rocks on top. basement rock underneath, great unconformity in between. And so you can see the whole thing has been gouged out, and it's helpful to look at that. It's also helpful to look at what secular scientists have said about this boundary called the great unconformity. What have they said about it? Secular scientists are beginning to they're beginning to catch up with reality, I think. Talking about that red line called the great unconformity, a colossal erosion event transformed ancient Earth's surface. What was this colossal erosion event? Another scientist said, excuse me, a massive proportion of ancient rocks were simply scraped off the surface of the Earth in an abrupt event like no other in Earth history. So scientists recognize this is the greatest, pardon me, I might interrupt you a few times. I'm recovering from a cough. Anyway, amazing to think that secular scientists recognize there is a discontinuity in the rock record unlike any other, and it matches with the onset of the flood, I believe. That's interpretive. Other scientists said one of geology's greatest mysteries, profound, enigmatic. There's nothing else like it in the entire rock record. And so we've got an amazing erosion event, and then layer upon layer of ocean on top of ocean creatures resting on top of continental rocks. And it's difficult to advance ocean on top of continent because continent tends to be more buoyant relative to ocean basins. And so it's not easy to submerge a continent. The continents are like big surfboards. It's hard to push them down to allow the oceans to advance. But they say, well, it must have happened repeatedly in Earth history. Or was there something more extreme? Was there a global flood? What would you expect to find? So if you go to Grand Canyon, they'll have ranger programs like this. Thank you, Sadie. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, that's nice. Thank you. If you go to Grand Canyon, you'll see ranger programs like where they get hold of kids, and and a little child will say something like this. It's all very cute and nice, right? They're standing on the rim of Grand Canyon. Rangers are giving a talk, right? And the child asks the question. Now this is my make-believe bubble here. How did those layers get there anyway? And what's the answer of the park rangers? What do you think? Gradually, gradually, gradually. Everything's normal, man. There's never any big violence here. The oceans crept in slowly and gradually. They laid down one layer of sediment. It's now sedimentary rock. And then the oceans went out. And then another couple 100 million years passed, and the oceans came in again, and the oceans went out. In and out dozens of times to build up this thing we call the sedimentary rock record. In other words, each layer represents an ancient environment, you see, where creatures lived and died in that ancient environment, and they got preserved for this wonderful record that tells us about millions of years of Earth history. So the questions, the children might ask, a child might ask a question of, well, how slowly did these layers accumulate? On the order of thousandths of a millimeter per year. Thousandths of a millimeter per year? The dust on your refrigerator accumulates faster than that. I mean, it's orders of magnitude faster than that. In other words, this is an extreme view of the rock record that we've accepted as sort of scientific. I'm here to tell you, I think it's science fraud. I think it's untrue, and I think there's too many extraordinary things about that rock record that scream out to me, that ought to scream out to anybody, that something wrong is with that story. And the child might ask, well, how do you get fossils? Oh, well, those accumulate slowly and gradually. Well, you're going to bury it at a millimeter per year or a fraction of a millimeter per year? Well, the thing will rot before you get it buried. Oh, well, those prehistoric oceans, you see, they had unusual low oxygen conditions, and therefore these creatures could die on the seafloor and just lay there for another million years or so until the next sediment comes along. This is the worldview that we deal with. This is the reason why people believe in millions of years. And I'd say that those park rangers are beholden to an artificial time scale determined by radioisotope dating, and they're forcing the time scale on the rock record, and it's fraud. I think it's fake. I think it's not true. And the sedimentary particles I have known help me with that. Now, why do people believe this way? If it's not true, why would people believe it? Well, I go to a passage in Scripture. I hope you can read my print there. This is from 2 Peter chapter 3. And some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but I think it's worth repeating. Peter, the old fisherman, was warning the church at that time. He says, look out, man, because in the last days, I'm going to prophesy something. In the last days, there's going to come mockers, and they're going to say what? I'll just read it. It says, know this of first importance, that's what he means, that in the last days mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming, of Christ's second coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For when, okay, now where have I heard that expression before? I'll highlight that in yellow. For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. I know where I've heard that. Page 1 of any geology textbook. That's where I've seen that. It pretends to be a scientific principle. It's got nothing to do with science. It's got everything to do with presumption, you see. And Peter goes on from there and he warns. He says, for when they're going to be willfully ignorant of two things. Creation, that the earth was created in water and out of water. That's Genesis 1 of the creation week. And that the world was destroyed, being flooded with water, referring to Genesis 6 through 10 of the creation week, the flood. Creation and the flood were predicted to be the two battleground issues of the last days. We're in those days today. And it's only happened in the last couple hundred years that people believe this kind of rubbish. As if this is science, it's total presumption to rule out the idea of catastrophes as unscientific, you see. And so, amazing thing to me. Why are creation and the flood important? Is that important? Can't I just have Jesus without that? Can I have my faith in Christ without creation and the flood? Well, creation reminds you that you're accountable to your Creator. If you don't start there, Jesus makes no sense at all, right? Okay, and then second thing, the flood reminds man of what? That he's subject to judgment, right? I'm going to be held accountable for my sins. So the idea that God created me, he owns me, number one, and number two, that God judged the world once, he's going to judge it again, it ought to make us tremble a little bit. Anyway, so creation and the flood, accountability and judgment are essential to the gospel because Christ went to the cross to pay the judgment for you and me. And so this is important to communicate. Okay, so let's keep going. So what is meant by a sedimentary particle? Geologists get kind of detailed and kind of anal, really, about what they do with sedimentary particles. You notice you got gravel and sand and mud, and then you got a finer scale there. You got clay, silt, sand, and a pebble, and a cobble, and a boulder. In other words, there's discrete numbers that you attach to the diameter of those things, and that's how you classify sedimentary rocks, or at least that's part of the way you do it. And notice mud is a type of sediment, isn't it? Type of sediment. And now, what is this young? Here's a young sedimentologist. What is he learning there? He's exploring textures of sediment, isn't he? And he notices that mud is really cool stuff to play in, right? And you can make mud cakes and so on. Because why? The particles stick together. So when you get mud particles, which are fine-grained particles, right? Mud, clay and silt and sand are considered mud, right? You get that stuff together, and the clay particles are so tiny, they're microscopic. They actually interact with water molecules, and that's why it has this peculiar properties that kids love, right? And some grown-ups love. Right? Sometimes I do, yeah. And so what do I mean by a sedimentary particle? It's an object capable of being suspended or transported in water. It might be rock, it could be organic, could be inorganic, could be rounded, could be angular, could be fine, could be coarse. But when it's cemented together, when you take sedimentary particles, you cement them together, you call it sedimentary rock, okay? So I'm giving you basic geology here. Huh? You guys are all, you're going to be treated like geologists today. And so at Mount St. Helens, like I said, it was primarily a sedimentological catastrophe more than it was of a volcanic one, I think. Yeah, of course, it's both, but notice how much sediment moved down that north fork of the Toutle River and dumped into the Cowlitz and made its way down into the Columbia. 4.2 cubic kilometers of sediment has moved down there in the last 40 years. That's enough to bury downtown Portland to a depth of 300 feet. Think about the volume of that. That's a lot of mud. And that's why you see spoils piles adjacent to, where the Toutle joins the Cowlitz. You see a kind of a mound of sand and silt. You see it elsewhere on the Columbia River. It costs millions of dollars per year, probably tens of millions, to keep those rivers dredged each year, because it's continually moving sediment down. So where does all that mud come from, right? How come there's mud? Well, here's the way it works. You get snow and ice. That mountain before the eruption was snow-capped, permanent glaciers, lots of snow, and then you heat it up and you send mix it with volcanic ash. You mix hot volcanic ash with snow and ice, what do you get? You get mud, that's right. And it looked like this. And so I'm going to talk to you today about mineral particles, right? Including mud. The mud was unbelievable at Mount St. Helens. And I like to emphasize this because it's just underappreciated, that's all. There's so many things with this eruption that are beyond normal human experience. It's tough to communicate, but mud is an amazing stuff. How much mud was moving down there? For the first 4 months after the eruption, how much mud was entering from the Toutle River into the Cowlitz? One relatively small river valley, 60 dump truck loads per minute. I estimate that based on the tons, millions of tons per minute and so on. And 60 dump truck loads per, in other words, picture one dump truck going by every second. That's how much mud was being transported for 4 months after, not the day of the eruption, but for 4 months later. All right, you can see what a catastrophe this was. And you get that mud lining the valley of the Cowlitz River, or the channel of the Cowlitz River, and guess what? There goes your margin for floods, right? And so in the spring, you're in danger of big-time flooding if you don't dredge that thing out. And that's why the dredging was so important. Same in the Columbia River. So I was for the next 7 years, excluding the first 4 months, it was the amount of mud going downstream was only on the order of 3 dump truck loads per minute. three dump trucks passing by every minute on the highway. Picture that. The river is like a conveyor belt that's hauling mud. Mud will be suspended in water in amazing ways. And then the average for 31 years is about 1/3 of a dump truck load per minute. What I'm communicating here is that water and mud really, if you have moving water, if you have a flood of any sort, there will be mud, right? And that gets my attention. Why? Because 2/3 of the sedimentary rock record is made of mud, mudstones, mud rocks, so to speak. So we got minerals here at Mount St. Helens, clay particles, and then you got big particles like this. Those things were rolling in the mud. Mud has the ability to, because it's denser than water when it's a mixture of mud and water, it will carry boulders. People describe those mud flows coming off of Mount St. Helens as something like oatmeal in the upper reaches of the Toutle River. It wasn't hot like lava, but it was steamy hot. And in the oatmeal were quote-unquote raisins like these, right? Boulders, some boulders 25-foot diameter boulders. And you got mud and you got different, oh man, the way that the mud flow transitioned from this oatmeal to just muddy water further downstream, it's such a cool study to look at. And then, so we got coarse minerals like these, they're boulders and so on. And then you got particles, clay particles that's a scanning electron microscope, 1700 magnification. In other words, you got tiny, tiny particles and you got big boulders. All of it was on the move. So we got mineral products that came down off of Mount St. Helens, and we got vegetable sedimentary particles too, right? There's some of your vegetables. Douglas fir, many of them 6, 8, 10-foot diameter trees, right? And you had sedimentary particles that came to rest on Spirit Lake. It was a floating log mat on Spirit Lake following the eruption. And then you had these kind of sedimentary particles, logs that were floating in Spirit Lake that settled in a fashion that is remarkable. And then you even had the bark from those floating logs sink down to the bottom. We're going to talk about that in just a minute here. We're going to get to that. So we got mineral particles, we got vegetable particles, and then we got one more, animal particles. Now, I don't have too much about Mount St. Helens with animals, but I know these guys in Kidd Valley tried to rescue their horses. They had to give it up. The horses were lost. The horses they got transported downriver as particles, right? Sedimentary particles, that's right. Horses were particles, right? And so I want to just expand your mind a little bit to thinking about this. And so those guys had to run for their lives. It's kind of a famous series of photographs, and those guys did because of the mud flow that was coming through. And the mud, just as a little reminder, that mud will transport houses and boulders and cars and bridges. It just takes that stuff and sweeps it downstream because it's way denser than water. It's extraordinarily powerful. Look at those homes floating in mud. I guess you'd call them mobile homes, right? And there were all kinds of debris that went washing down that river along with the logs and the boulders and the mud. Houses like this just destroyed. 200 homes destroyed, 200 miles of highway destroyed, mostly by mud. Cars became sedimentary particles. Logging trucks were on the move. Destroyed highways like this. So we can think of, so I'm trying to use this as just an opener, talking about the great sedimentary particles I've known, and we can see that, what are these? Those are kind of, let's call those ordinary sedimentary particles. They're rocks and boulders and logs and that kind of thing. We'll call those kind of ordinary sedimentary particles, right? And then from Mount St. Helens, we learned that these kind of things, right? What are those? Trucks, kitchen sinks, horses, cars, all that stuff was on the move down the Toutle River. So we'll call those extraordinary sedimentary particles. And then we'll do one more category. I'm just going to expand your thinking here. What are those things? I'm here to tell you that those were sedimentary particles. Dinosaurs and fossils. We don't have a record of ancient environments. We've got a record of ancient destruction, of transport of animals as sedimentary particles. In most cases, we don't know where the dinosaurs lived. We know where they came to rest as a result of transportation. That's the real story with dinosaurs. I don't really get too excited about what most paleontologists get off on, like, oh, here's what the animals eat, and here's what the dinosaurs, here's the Jurassic Park where they played, and here's this, and here's that. I'm more interested in the conditions of burial for those things. The conditions of burial are the extraordinary story. And so we'll call those extreme sedimentary particles. What do you think? Is that okay? Okay, so now I've given you that kind of introduction. Let's look at some extreme animal sedimentary particles that I've known. I want to talk about 3: nautiloids, dinosaurs, ichthyosaurs. Right? That's all. This is fun. I hope you're interested in this. I'm kind of weird. I'm a geologist, I know. But let's go to Grand Canyon, and let's go, this is what I call In Search of the Elusive Desert Squid. Okay? This is a project I was working with Dr. Steve Austin on. I was his research buddy for several years on this project. It was an amazing project, because in those rock layers are these kind of creatures called nautiloids. Well, what's a nautiloid? It's an extinct form of swimming cephalopod, or like a squid-like creature that lived in a shell. And the shells are long, narrow things with chambers in them, and that thing had a little tube running down the middle of it, so we could pressurize individual chambers, and we think they're able to dive to terrific depths and also surface again, and they're among the fastest swimmers probably of any creatures out in the ocean. Anyway, pretty amazing creatures, and they're typically about the length of your arm. And I want to go on a desert squid adventure with you. So in Grand Canyon, these are what I call extreme animal particles, part 1. That's where we're going to. One layer in the middle of the big cliff forming unit, in the middle, halfway up the canyon from the river to the rim, is known as the red wall limestone. And in that limestone, that's a picture of it there, and that's a geologic kind of column describing the kind of rock it is, and our destination is going to be that level right there. That level right there really gets my attention because it's interesting. And getting there is never easy. You either have to hike from the rim, and usually it'll be an overnight trip, or more, or you float down the river and hike from the river up. And so it's never easy to get to. And as you're hiking through the red wall limestone, what do you see? Horn corals, crinoids, brachiopods, bryozoans. It's really fun. It's like a paleontology lab looking at the fossils as you're hiking down the trail. Now, what gets my attention here is those are marine fossils. And you're up at 6,000 feet above sea level. You think those seashells and sea creatures got that way because they crawled up on the mountain? What's that? Yeah, good hikers, yeah. Maybe, yeah. You picture little horn corals wearing boots, and hiking in his boots. Yeah, so no, that's a record of, and not one of those creatures are found in the natural growth position. They're all different orientations in the rock, telling you that they were sedimentary particles. Very interesting to me. And so you see those things. So what we have here is a record of the ocean sweeping on top of the continent. You see, all geologists believe that North America was underwater. They all believe that. They just say it happened slowly and gradually, you see. We say it happened rapidly. Very interesting to think about this. I think we should be amazed when we see things like this, like the early Christians were in the first centuries after the church. Did you know that people like Augustine, Chrysostom, and Tertullian, they would back their atheist friends up into the hills and say, how do you explain those fish fossils up on the mountaintop if there wasn't a global flood? And if there was a global flood, what does that tell you about God's holiness and his hatred for sin? And can I tell you about Jesus, my friend? They would go from fossils to Jesus. And it's perfectly valid to do today. It's the same argument. The only difference is today we're just too intimidated to do it, that's all. The evidence is perfectly plain that something extreme must have happened in history to explain seashells thousands of feet above sea level. And we just treat it as normal. Oh, this is just ancient environments, Come on, you gotta be kidding me. Let's keep going. We're hiking down Grand Canyon. We finally get to this one layer called the Whitmore nautiloid bed of the red wall limestone. And there we find these kind of creatures. Look at that. It looks like the cone-shaped shell of nautiloids. And it's really fun to spot them in the rock. Some of them are quite big. I hope you can make that one out. It's got a shape like that, and amazing to look at. Squid-like creatures in those rock layers. And a lot of data were collected on these things, including their diameter, their size, their shape, the direction they were pointing in. And I just got some pictures here to show you. And some of them were even found. Notice the one that's a circle there in the upper right. You see that? Some of those nautiloids were buried perpendicular to the strata. In other words, they weren't just old nautiloids falling to the seafloor. They got buried in some kind of a catastrophic flow where they landed in a vertical position. About 1/10 of them turn out to be vertical like that. Amazing. So you're looking at the cross-sectional view of a nautiloid there, that circle, that's what it is. And so the thing is standing vertically in the rock. And you got nautiloids that are, longer than your arm, and you've got little tiny nautiloids a couple inches long, and you got everything in between, indicating it's an entire population that got whacked somehow. Most of them are oriented in a current. There's one that imploded, indicating it had soft tissue in its body at the time it was buried. In other words, the pressure of the sediment landing on top of that thing caused the thing to implode, right? Or to essentially be destroyed, right? That's important information. So we're collecting information here. This is leading to the work that Dr. Stephen Austin published, and which I think is a great challenge for people to think about. And so there are these things. If you look at that exposure there, the horizontal bed, it's got puck marks on the top of it. It's got kind of vertical lines on the vertical face. And what are those? It looks like water escape structures. In other words, when it got buried, water was bubbling up through the thing. And so all kinds of data were collected on this thing, on the Whitmore nautiloid bed, including the preferred orientation of these things. There's direction of flow. You can see that there was a current involved when those things got buried. That's important information. You're looking at one data set of 163 nautiloids in one outcrop. In other words, you can count them. You can hopscotch across, stepping on one nautiloid to another. That's how densely packed they are in that one layer. And other information that were collected. The shell diameter. Some of them were great big shells with a diameter of almost 2 feet. Some were huge nautiloids, which would be maybe a 6 or 10 foot creature. Others were only a couple centimeters in diameter. That's important information. So it looks like a living population of creatures disappeared all at once. It wasn't just the old ones that were dying of old age here. Something happened suddenly. And the nautiloids, this is the most amazing thing. They're found from one end of Grand Canyon to another. This is a map showing the locations where it was found. And you can see that Whitmore nautiloid bed in Marble Canyon, and you can trace it all the way to the west as far as Las Vegas, and you can see where you have optimal exposure of that one bed, it will be like one nautiloid every 2 square meters. So if you had optimal exposure, if you can imagine that, and you don't, it's mostly cliff that you're looking at in Grand Canyon. But if you did have optimal exposure, you could walk on that platform, you could hopscotch for 200 miles stepping on nothing but dead nautiloids. And you don't see nautiloids in the layers above it or the layers above it. It's just that one layer. And it's an amazing, and people, secular scientists have said, Steve, we don't care for your creationist ideas, but you have probably the greatest fossil discovery in all of Grand Canyon history. And I think it's true. So that Whitmore nautiloid bed, it demands unusual burial conditions. What happened to explain this bed? And notice that Whitmore nautiloid bed is similar to the other strata above it and below it. It just happens to have nautiloids in this one. He proposed a sedimentary model. Here's an underwater gravity flow. Look at that. I got some nautiloids there, right? This is like a 20-year-old technology here. So you have an underwater sediment gravity flow rushing down at probably freeway speed, and it's sweeping up nautiloids and depositing them, not in the top of the layer, not in the bottom, but in the middle part of the layer. That's where they're found. And so this kind of a model had been proposed before only in volcanic pyroclastic flows, violent pyroclastic. This is the first time it was ever published that you had this kind of a sediment gravity flow in carbonate mud, limestone mud, that produced this kind of thing. And so the amount of sediment in that one layer would be enough, I like to keep numbers like this, enough sediment to bury the state of New Jersey 16 feet in mud, right? Now that, some people think that might be a good idea. Anyway, yeah. But that layer, though, is not very different from the other layers in the red wall limestone. And you know, previous to this work, you know what that red wall limestone was considered? And the red wall limestone, that's proof positive of slow and gradual lime muds that have built up over millions of years. And in fact, Steve, the whole history of this is interesting because Steve received a challenge from a secular scientist who said, I dare you. He said, I can see how you can make a catastrophic argument for individual strata in Grand Canyon, the Tepete sandstone, the different layers, the Kaibab, and so on. But he says, I dare you, Steve Austin, to give a catastrophic interpretation for the red wall limestone. That stuck in his craw. And he was down in Grand Canyon assisting. He was a professor, and there was a graduate student who was mapping some strata in the Grand Canyon. And he was kind of restricted there, waiting for him to do his measurements. And he had a research vessel there, a raft, that he could go and motor to other canyons. And he discovered that the one place where there was a place called Nautiloid Canyon where everybody knew those nautiloids were there, but nobody knew how extensive it was. He was the first one who expanded the extent of it, just because he found himself with extra time on his hands, and also because that one evolutionist kind of stuck in his craw. So if we think of the nautiloid bed as a report for a mass kill deposit, what was the cause of death for those creatures? Asphyxiation. Billions of victims, including young and old, beneath one smothering blanket of lime silt. That's the way those things got buried, and it's unquestionably the case. That is how you explain at least one layer in Grand Canyon. Where did the crime take place? The victims were strewn across 200 miles of the Grand Canyon region after being transported an unknown distance. Who perpetrated the crime? When and where? See, I like to play this game of being a crime scene investigator, you know, and it's fun to think about this. And you have to ask yourself, is that the kind of thing you'd expect to be going on during Noah's flood? And the answer is absolutely yes. That's what I would expect to see. And even, I just throw this in too, just for fun. The Native Americans, one of the best exposures of the nautiloid bed was on the Wallapai Indian lands. And I went out there to do an excavation, to excavate one nautiloid from this a really beautiful nautiloid that we needed to do for research. And so Steve sent me out there with a team of other guys, and we had to deal with the tribal council to get permission to go out there, because you're taking a piece of Mother Earth, you know. This is kind of sacred thing for the Indians. And I got to meet this one lady who was the editor for this book called Spirit Mountain. And that's her lady, her name is Lucille Watahamaji. And I got to meet her, and she's a scholarly lady, and she's not not just an ignorant Native American or something like that. She's really an interesting lady. And she wrote in that book, and I read the book, and she wrote in that book that the Wallapai people have a flood legend that's unbelievable. And she published it in the book, that the Wallapai believed that there was a big flood that came through the region. And the details included, 40 days of rain, including a bird that went out after the thing, including 8 people rescued in a boat, including all this stuff. And I'm like, and I asked her, I said, you must recognize the similarities between this account that the Wallapai have and the account in the Bible. There's obviously is there any, and when you're dealing with Native Americans, they always appreciate if you're blunt with them. Don't beat around the bush, right? And so I asked her bluntly, I said, what's the chances that the Wallapai tribe borrowed their account from missionaries who were carrying their Bible, something like that? And she said, she looked at me in a very funny way, and she said, there's no chance of that. First of all, we hate the white men. Secondly, we wouldn't want to borrow their stories. And furthermore, she said, I heard that story from, I got that flood tradition, that story, which we celebrated only in song and dance, never been put to literature. Hers was the first time it was put in white man's language. And she says there's no chance it got corrupted. I got that from my grandfather, and it wasn't long before that, or it wasn't long after that, the missionaries came, first missionaries. So this is something, and I thought that was extraordinary. And I got to tell her that we're doing nautiloid research on Wallapai land that testifies of a global flood. Aren't you interested in that? And she almost got embarrassed. As if, well, it's kind of Wallapai tradition, it's almost like superstition, They don't really take it seriously. And I'm telling her that you ought to take this seriously. You ought to tell your young people about this. And anyway, and she says, now where is it that you want to go and do this research? I said, this place called Jeff Canyon, way out in the really remote part of western Grand Canyon. They have an enormous reservation. And she says, Jeff Canyon? That's a obscure small canyon, side canyon leading into the Grand Canyon. And she said, that's where I grew up. Really? And she says, yeah. And so she came out there when we did a field trip, and she joined us just to see these things. She hiked out there with us, and a kind of older lady, anyway. So it's a little side issue talking about flood stories. And let's keep going. Let's keep talking about other animal particles I have known, right? And so this is the nautiloids. Let's go ahead. I want to talk to you about these things. Now, what is that? That is, that's a fossil creature called an ichthyosaur, right? And they found thousands of those things in the sedimentary rock record. And some of them are the size of small submarines. They're big. In fact, the biggest one fully documented is like 82 feet long, right? And they found parts of one that they think probably belonged to a creature that was 100 feet long, indicating those things were some of the biggest creatures to ever swim the oceans, as big as a blue whale, right? Anyway, so kind of fun things to look at, and the reason that piqued my interest in this is, J.D. Mitchell's here. He's responsible for our Dinosaur and Fossil Museum at the Creation Center, and you ought to check that out because it's cool. And he added just recently, he added a ichthyosaur exhibit, and that kind of got me researching and interested in this subject, and I never really looked at it before. But what are these creatures? They're air-breathing. They give live birth. They have blubber on. It appears because the soft tissue is preserved so well on some of them. They apparently had blubber on the outside like a whale does. And they think because of the streamlined fashion, it was among the fastest of all swimmers. And the thing that's really noticeable about them is they got huge eyes. And nobody knows what that's all about. But anyway, so are they fish? Are they reptile? Are they mammal? What are they? They give live birth to creatures. A lot of them are preserved in the act of giving birth, and that's the one we got in our creation center. There's a ichthyosaur. We got a replica or a little model of an ichthyosaur giving birth. So this is so the evolutionists are completely flummoxed by this. It's a little bit like a platypus of the animal world, and they don't know what to do with it. There's not a hint of an ancestor in the fossil record. They know this. The things appeared. They want to believe that it evolved from reptiles. In other words, it was a land creature that evolved into a fish. And just like the story of the whale, supposedly whales evolved from land animals. Did you know that? And Stephen Jay Gould, the famous evolutionist, said, this is an extraordinary story of convergent evolution. Now, what's convergent evolution? It's when you see the whole thing. Not only did these things learn to evolve from land animals to sea creatures, but whales evolved from land animals to sea creatures. They say, evolution is amazing. Well, some people call it amazing. I'd call it ridiculous. Right? But that's my opinion. But many of these things are buried with soft tissue and found in them. Anyway, I want to just bring out a few things about ichthyosaurs. So some of them are incredibly well preserved, and they're known to have eyes, amazing eyes. Some have eyes that are like a 2-foot diameter eyeball on them, or the eye socket that they find. The average size is about 6 feet to 13 feet, but some are as big as 82 feet. Thousands are found worldwide, etc. One amazing deposit I happened to research or look at was one in the Patagonian Mountains in southern Chile, and or in the Andes Mountains, the end of the Andes. And there are 76 specimens of these creatures preserved in the rocks far above sea level. And this is the thing that's amazing. They're buried along with, first of all, they have soft tissue inside them. In other words, there's actual proteins and skin tissue and so on. There's embryos of the creatures with them. And they're buried with cephalopods, squid, bivalves, fish, and land plants. Plants are buried with these things. And they say, how did those things get buried in the rock like that? Oh, well, you see, it looks like we've studied the strata here, and it looks like it was an underwater debris flow. In other words, a catastrophic debris flow that swept these things out into the ocean, and they got buried in very deep water with land plants, with other debris. In other words, they got swept away they were sedimentary particles the size of submarines that were being swept out to the ocean. And so a lot of them are, this is just a diagram of one fossil. They actually found a fossil like this where you can see the thing was giving birth at the time it got buried, indicating the burial event had to be something that was sudden. It wasn't slow and gradual, and that thing got buried. And so the baby is coming out, and notice there's 3 embryos inside the mother there. They're kind of stacked like cordwood inside, and they actually identified that in this one fossil. Amazing. So we're talking about transportation of enormous sedimentary particles, and there was one that I came across just yesterday, in fact, and there was a segment of a ichthyosaur that was found penetrating multiple strata, and that's my diagram to help depict it. But it was buried up to the first fin, which means it's probably at least 1 meter thick, and it penetrates 3 different ammonite zones, indicating it was different geologic ages of strata. And so it's a polystrate ichthyosaur. What do you think of that? Amazing. So ichthyosaur that's buried vertically, penetrating 3 different layers, and the front of the creature, including the head, was, I just got it from an abstract. I couldn't read the whole article. I couldn't have access to it, but it was buried up to the fins and at least 1 meter deep. And the authors hint that maybe the rate of burial was somewhat higher than the average rate for that interval. And what is the average rate of burial for that interval? Can you believe that? They actually published this. 0.0005 millimeters per year. You think you're going to pickle a thing like that? At that rate of burial, the whole thing is going to rot or at least fall over. You imagine it's going to stick in its nose in the sediment, and then the other strata come around it. You know, what happened to this thing? They don't know. I'm telling you, I get a little bothered that young people are told, you're given the impression that, we scientists, we kind of got things figured out when it comes to Earth history, And if you want to study Earth history, well, that's cool, but you can kind of do a side mop-up operation over here. But we've got the big picture settled now. The opposite is the case. They don't have a clue about what it's tons of mysteries out there. And kids who are interested in science, they ought to be encouraged to study this if the opportunity presents itself and if they're the right kind of person to do it. Anyway. Very interesting to me. Okay, let's go to, we're spending a lot of time on animal particles. We talked about the ichthyosaur, and we talked about the nautiloids, marine creatures. Let's talk about some terrestrial sedimentary particles. Let's talk about dinosaurs. Here we are in northeastern Utah, and we're looking at the famous wall. It's the best in situ display of dinosaurs anywhere in the world, where you can see this one sedimentary layer, and I use the expression, it looks like a tangled train wreck of dinosaurs. Some are fully articulated. Some of the world's most famous dinosaurs stand in the great museums around the world that were extracted from this particular area, this wall right here. The sediment they're buried in matches with the volcanic mud flows from Mount St. Helens. In other words, the same kind of mud that stacked up cars and houses and boulders in the Toutle River is the same kind of mud that buried your dinosaurs at Dinosaur National Monument. The only difference is at Dinosaur National Monument, the thickness of the mud is hundreds of feet thick, and it covers a multi-state region, a giant pancake of volcanic type mud that buried these dinosaurs. And that's your big dinosaur repository, one of the big ones in the western US. Are you going to tell me that this was a peaceful, tranquil Jurassic Park world where these things lived in? Well, maybe they did, but all we've got access to is their burial site, which looks utterly catastrophic. They've got soft tissue inside their bones. There's measurable C14 inside their bones. If you know anything about C14, it cannot possibly exist in objects of 1 million years. These things are claimed to be 70 million because it's got a short half-life. How much C14 should be in a dinosaur bone? 0.00000. In other words, and it's well above instrument threshold, and routinely they get this. Either you should throw away all your C14 dating method, or else admit you've got a young Earth here. You got something way younger than 70 million years here. And furthermore, the bones are current aligned. And it's buried with not just dinosaurs, but clams and pebbles, and all got transported. Nothing is in situ. In fact, that is the case with the entire sedimentary rock record. Can you find an ancient environment, where you can say this is truly an in situ environment, anywhere between Cambrian and Cretaceous, which is most of the sedimentary rock record? I'd like to know, because I don't see anything that looks like it's hands down, you can say that for sure. Everything looks like it was transported, got dumped. The whole sedimentary rock record is this way. And so that's Dinosaur National Monument. And then over in Europe, it's the rule, not the exception, that those dinosaurs are buried with marine fossils. Yeah. Fish, marine invertebrates, clams and so on, and microfossils in an aquatic, if not marine setting. That's the rule, not the exception for these kind of dinosaurs. Those pictures of dinosaurs that they've gotten from France. And this seems to be the case across most of Europe. They were obviously transported as, quote, sedimentary particles before burial. Nobody talks about this stuff, but it's perfectly obvious that they were transported. And I don't, anyway, so theropod dinosaurs are found in Morocco. This is in North Africa, right? Mixed with what? Sharks, fish, and marine turtles. Oh, you think they lived along side by side with sharks and turtles, these land dinosaurs? I don't think so, right? Something extraordinary happened here. Here's what this scientist said, Longrich, in just this year, 2024. Quote, "It's not clear how dinosaur bones ended up in marine sediments." That's a good understatement, right? Dinosaurs may have swum out to islands searching for food as deer or elephants do today, and some might have drowned. Other dinosaurs might have been washed out to sea by floods or storms, or drowned in rivers that carried them downstream to the ocean. Still others may have died on the shoreline before being carried out on a high tide, but some improbable series of events transported dinosaurs into the ocean. Yeah, I'd say so. This is the rule, not the exception. This is. Look at this. This one here is called the ankylosaur. Ankylosaurs and nautiloids are ones that are very frequently found in marine strata, in layers with seashells and stuff in them. Well, they weren't living with seashells, were they? You don't have an ancient environment here. You've got an ancient dump of different types of material, marine and terrestrial creatures buried together. Are you kidding me? And you see depictions like this. This is Japanese hadrosaurs, right? And they're always depicted as foraging along the ocean basin. Why? Because they're found buried with a mix of sea turtles, ammonites, plesiosaurs, and other obvious marine creatures. Why are we treating this as it's just normal? Well, here we have some hadrosaurs buried with marine creatures, just ancient environment. What a crazy thing. The conditions of burial for these things just continually amaze me. This is in New Mexico. This is called the Ghost Ranch deposit. It's a Coelophysis fossils, almost exclusively, in a mass kill bed. And they're stacked up like wood. And what happened here? They were obviously transported in moving water of some sort. About 1,000 individuals were excavated. Several thousand remain. A large number of them are well articulated. In other words, it's a complete skeleton. And you got young and old ones. There's no indication of decay or scavenging. And the bones are current, aligned, and buried with pieces of wood. So what I'm getting at is animal particles like dinosaurs, like ichthyosaurs, like nautiloids. These things went through extreme transport and then extreme conditions of burial, and nobody's talking about it. But it's what I would expect if there was a global flood. Okay, and then that's 2/3 of our session, and then we'll next one is extreme vegetable sedimentary particles I've known, and this is cool too. So and there's similarities here.
And we'll take a break. Is this a good time for a break, Bill? Okay. Mm-hmm. We'll take a break. And
can you hear me? Okay, good. What a privilege it is to meet with some of you in here. And you know, we're a group like this. There's little watering holes like this around the country that meet once a week or something like this, or once a month. And you know, you can find churches of Jesus Christ around the world too. Little watering holes here and there and everywhere. We're a minority, but I believe we got all of truth behind us. Okay, good. So let's keep going. I left off with we're going to talk. Maybe this is good for warm up for lunch. Extreme vegetable particles I've known. What do you think? And and so I'd like to talk to you about so-called petrified forests. Just a couple brief words. And then we wanted to talk about the origin of coal. Coal is this black stuff. And but if you go to what we're doing here is I'm trying to expand your understanding, thinking about sedimentary particles in a different way. And here we have a place called, anybody ever been there? That's called Petrified Forest National Park, right? It's, what is it? Is it a forest? No. it's a petrified log mat. You don't have trees standing upright. They're all laying prone, broken up in pieces like this, sometimes really beautiful ones, right? And buried with those particles are mammals, reptiles like turtles, lizards, dinosaurs, crocodilians, frogs, and birds. Shark and coelacanth fossils show up too, right? These are sea creatures. Most sharks are also marine. It takes a cataclysm to slam an ocean onto land. That's Brian Thomas, ICR. Good people out there. And by the way, this is the same layer, the Shinli Formation, where they find the coelophysis fossils, right? Those stacked up, those dinosaurs stacked up in 1,000 or more in one layer. And over here you got logs laying around. Over there you got dinosaurs. Those things were transported. Where did they once grow? Nobody has a clue where they grew. They're just buried. You just find them out there in the desert, petrified logs laying around. You can walk around the things, and it's amazing. And the question is this: why don't we find anywhere in the fossil record any clear example of a rooted tree stump? Because that has survivability of being preserved in the fossil record. I wouldn't expect soft tissue to be preserved, but I might expect a tree stump somewhere to turn up in the rock record. We don't have anything like that at all. Instead, you got pieces of wood laying around like this. Let's talk about vegetable number 2, coal. What is coal? Coal is this black stuff. It remains a foremost energy source in the world today. And how does coal form? Well, you ask any geologist, they'll tell you that you have to begin with a swamp. You see, there's this ancient swamp, and the peat builds up over millions of years, and with time and with pressure. Notice time is always part of it. Time and pressure, that peat, which is organics, mixture of plants and roots and different parts of the plant, it gets compressed into this thing called coal, and it gets altered, and it turns black, and that's the way the alteration process happens. So the standard theory is an in situ swamp. That's the standard explanation for coal. There's another argument for the origin of coal, and the argument is this: that there were giant floating log mats. Now, this is a picture of Mount St. Helens, and there you had a pretty big floating log mat, and how did those logs wind up in Spirit Lake? Because those floating logs, I'm going to show you that this has a great explanation for the origin of coal. How did those logs get in Spirit Lake? Well, on May 18th, 1980, there was a big landslide. It's the north side of Mount St. Helens there, and it gave way in the largest landslide in recorded history. That picture is one of my favorite pictures because you're looking at a slab. The north face of the mountain is sliding away at about 150 miles an hour, and that no one has lived to see a bigger landslide than that one. Technically, you call it a debris avalanche, but it's essentially the mountain is falling under the force of gravity, and when it falls away, the pressurized water and gases at depth, they flash to steam, and you get the power of that lateral blast. It didn't blow upward, it blew outward, at least initially for the first several minutes. So it looked like this from 11 miles away. The guy who took these pictures is now world famous. He escaped with his life. He was 11 miles away when he took these pictures. That's what he saw, right? So notice the landslide is just screaming down the side of the mountain. And then you have the blast cloud going out, and it left, because of the landslide, it slid into Spirit Lake. What happens to water when you give it a good shove with a rock body that slams into it? What happens to that water? I like to ask kids, let's make believe you're sitting in the bathtub and your little sister jumps in the tub. What happens to the water? Well, it makes a big wave, doesn't it? Yeah. How high do you think the wave was that sloshed up on the side of the mountain next to Spirit Lake? 860 feet. Did you know that? And we take groups down there and we look at the scour marks on the side of the mountain. It's perfectly obvious it really happened. Nobody got a picture of it. It would have been a great picture. But the volcano was in full eruption at the time. Nobody's looking at the lake. They were looking at the volcano. Anyway, so you're looking at a picture here of Dr. Steve Austin talking to, what's his name, with Is Genesis History, Del Tackett. A great series, by the way. I recommend it. And they're talking about the floating logs out here. And Steve is telling the story of years ago when he was a young man at where? At Penn State University. I love telling this story. I get to brag about Steve Austin. He doesn't brag about this. I get to brag for him. He was a student at Penn State University. The year was 1979, 1 year before the eruption of Mount St. Helens. He went into that department and said, hey, I've got a different theory for the origin of coal. They said, oh, really? He says, you see, you got it all wrong with this whole swamp thing. You see, there was a big flood that covered North America. And as the logs blew together on the surface of that flood water, it may have created a whole vegetation mats that were floating around in the flood waters. And as the trees rubbed against each other, those logs rubbed against each other, the tree bark fell to the bottom, forming a tree bark rich layer of peat lining the surface of the continent, forming these massive coal beds that you see that extend over multi-state regions in the Midwestern United States. What do you think his professor said to him? Steve, we really don't care for your wacko creationist ideas around here, but you know what? You've got a better explanation for the origin of coal because it's mystified geologists for a century, or for at least a century, that coal, that your big coal beds, at least many of them in the Midwest, the so-called carboniferous coals, are what? They're dominated by tree bark. Not the spores, not the leaves, not the stems of plants that you'd find in a swamp, but tree. Why tree bark? Why? It's altered tree bark. That's what coal is made of, or at least a lot of the coals are made of that. And so his professors looked at his work, and they said, Steve, we don't care for you. We've got a very hypothetical, a very abstract model here, but you know what? It's a better mousetrap. It's a better explanation for the origin of coal than our stupid swamp model. So here's your PhD. Please be on your way. He graduated in 1979 from Penn State University with a floating log mat model, a flood model for the origin of coal. And what happened less than a year later? A floating log mat? What was Steve? Steve Austin's going, what? A floating log mat? Are you kidding me? And he had, suddenly his abstract model had a real life thing to look at. And being a professional diver, he went diving under the lake a couple of years after the eruption and was able to document on the bottom of Spirit Lake is a 3-foot thick layer, at least up to 3 feet thick, lining the bottom of Spirit Lake, the perfect scenario for the origin of coal. And let no one say that coal is forming today on the bottom of Spirit. It's not. It's rotting is what's happening. But in order to get coal, you would need subsequent burial under other sediments. A little pressure can convert that stuff to coal. But it vindicated one key part of his model, that you can imagine a scenario like this. It would be a perfect model. And he's defended his ideas at professional coal societies since then, and they all say the same thing. They say, Steve, we don't care for your creationist ideas around here, but thank you, get out of here, And the funny thing is, Steve was a former UW student. He was he did his master's, I think, at University of Washington. So he knew about Spirit Lake already. It was one of his favorite. He knew about Mount St. Helens. And when it blew, he thought, oh, it's my favorite mountain. It's just gone. Huh? And yet it turned into a floating log. Perfect thing for his model. I use that to encourage young people. I say, if God's given you the conviction that the Bible's true in any discipline, you ought to stick to your convictions. I don't care whether your study is in home economics or physics or what it might be. You ought to, because I think God's going to vindicate you. That's what he did for Steve Austin. Sometimes I wonder if God didn't blow up Mount St. Helens just for Steve Austin. And so I just love telling that story, right? And so the floating log mat model, that was his model. That's a little cartoon there. That during the flood, you can imagine floating log mats, maybe even with vegetation growing on top of them, and raining down bark-rich pieces of peat, some big pieces, some small, but forming a tree bark-rich layer of peat on the bottom of the lake like that, or on the bottom of the continent. And that's what the sheets, some of the pieces of tree bark on the bottom of Spirit Lake look like that. It sounds outrageous to think that there could be floating log mats during the flood. But you know, you've got to go with something outrageous like that in order to explain what we see in the rock record. First of all, we know that floating islands are known since the mid-1980s. In fact, 1880s, I should say. In the Congo, people reported this in 1884. People who were coal geologists were reporting on this, and that used to be a popular explanation for the origin of coal. Today it's been kind of pushed aside, though. This is a lake in Finland. That's a floating island with vegetation growing on it. We know these things happen. Here's another one in Peru, right, where people actually live on that thing. Isn't that crazy? And it's an island, and here you got one in India. So these things are known. And my experience was, I remember being an undergraduate student, and I was visiting some people in central Nevada, Elko, Nevada, and another town called Eureka. And down near there was a pond that was fed by a hot spring. And we went, one of my only times I ever went scuba diving in my life, we went scuba diving in this pond to swim around. And what was there in the middle of the pond but a floating island? And it was, you know, maybe a meter thick of soil with lots of roots and so on in it to keep it buoyant. And on top of it were growing grasses and even small trees were growing on. And you could climb on top of it and walk around. It was like you're walking on a little bit spongy, but man, it was pretty solid. And so that's my experience with floating islands. Anyway, so we know they're conceivable. Could they have been much, much bigger at the time of the flood? That's the question. Let's look at coal. Coal is an amazing, it's really quite strange when you look at it. The style of bedding is weird. The types of trees that are in it are weird. The bedfellows, what I call it's buried with marine creatures, doesn't look like a terrestrial swamp at all. The burial style, the so-called soil zone, texture is weird, purity is incredible. That's what a lot of your coal beds look like in the Midwestern United States. And they're found in these things called cyclothems, which are cycles of coal, then shale, then sand, then limestone, then coal, then shale, then sand, and it's stacked up like that. And it's pretty peculiar, right? So coal appears cyclically with other strata, and in those other strata, even strata above and below the coal, are marine creatures, obviously sea creatures. How come you got a swamp in the middle of sea creatures? You see, that's the question. It's repeated tens of times in a lot of these outcrops, and in some you got like 100 coal seams in one outcrop, and they can be thick. They can be traced over colossal areas. Some individual coal seams, inches thick, can be traced over like a 9-state region, 100,000 square miles of area. Individual little coal seams that thick can be traced over that kind of distance. It's staggering to think about. Here's what it looks like, and if you drive around Kentucky, you see things like that, road cuts like that. And this is your big so-called carboniferous coals, right? Anyway, so what kind of trees are associated with these coals? First of all, they're strange. That's the first thing you can say. They're extinct types of trees that lycopods, cordiates, which is a conifer, tree ferns, calamites. That's the major kind of things. They find these trunks as well. And here's what they look like when they're buried in the rock. Polystrata, right? This is nearby to a coal bed. You don't find them rooted in the coal beds. The fossil logs are not rooted. They're associated with the coal beds. They're nearby. And the odd features of these so-called lycopod trees are what? Hollow air chambers in both the trunk and the root. Well documented. And the hollowness is not due to rotting. And sometimes there'll be exotic sediment inside the hollow parts of the thing that are not from the nearby deposits at all. Some kind of other weird things with fossils in them and so on. Tons of weird things to look at. The roots don't go down. They find some of these things with roots attached to the stumps. They don't go down like a taproot would on a normal, what we call most normal trees. Instead, the roots they flare out horizontally. And the blunt end and the tapered rootlets are incapable of penetrating soil, and they're arranged like a bottle brush. I'll give you a little picture. Like modern water plants they have tender little roots. They don't have the kind of hard roots that can actually penetrate a soil. Something is weird about these trees. And the roots are found above and below the coal seams, never within, and with few exceptions, they're disconnected from the trunks. They're fragmented and they tend to be current aligned. So you got fragments of roots, tree roots, that are aligned with the current, buried nearby to the coal seams, not in them. So what I'm getting at is this is a weird picture, right? And the spores for these types of trees were dispersed. Every tree has a different methodology for transporting its spores, right? This one had little boat-like structures designed for water dispersal. It's obvious. So these are some kind of weird like water trees. That's what they look like. It's a lycopod root there. Look at that. The trunk comes down and then the roots flare out. They don't go down. They just flare out and they're hollow on the inside. And that's the kind of pattern. They actually follow a very strict mathematical pattern the way they disperse. That's what they look like. And the little rootlets at the end are the kind of rootlets that you'd expect in a water plant, not the kind that can penetrate a soil. So this is all well documented. Everybody knows this is what coal is made of. And nobody talks about it, right? And so there's also strange bedfellows. In other words, there's marine fossils buried with those things. Now they look kind of weird in that picture. They're not, but there's in one area, one phenomenal place called Mason Creek, Illinois, where you got some of these big coal beds and cyclothems. You see sea creature fossils, extinct squid-like creatures, worms, found in close association with lycopod trees and coal seams. Again, you got this mixture of marine creatures buried in the same deposit with what appear to be land plants. The whole thing is amazing. This one report said, quote, near torrential sediment aggradation is required to bury these fossils, which include upright tree trunks, escape burrows, and soft-bodied animals. In other words, rapid sedimentation. Coal balls are found inside. These things are enigmas. Nobody knows how to explain these things. They're like cannonballs with incredibly well-preserved fossils inside them, calcite concretions with marine shellfish, land plants, sometimes mixed, and they must have formed early after burial and exquisitely preserved. Amazing stuff, right? And the marine tube worm, this thing, there's a modern tube worm. This thing bores into wood, any kind of floating wood, it'll live in there. That's the way the thing lives. I don't know. And so it's called Spirorbis, and it's nearly identical with ones in the fossil record claimed to be 300 million years old, and it's bored into these lycopod trees. So you got marine creatures, you got marine brachiopods reported, both in the underclays and within the coal seams. You have these things, these Hebes living in there. Okay? And then strange burial conditions. Logs found vertically tipped Some are found vertically penetrating strata that are claimed to be long ages to form. Can't possibly be. You got another case like the ichthyosaur was stuck in the mud before. You got logs penetrating vertical strata. You got some diagonally tipped ones. This is a picture, an amazing picture. Fossil trees, some are inclined. Excuse me. Some are vertical, some are found upside down, right? Indicating that these things were transported as sedimentary particles, and the coal is somehow associated with these trees. Could it be tree bark that rubbed off these trees that were floating in a giant log mat? More lycopod trees. One more thing about coals, strange soils, the underclay. What's that? There's this kind of clay underneath a lot of, not all of them, but a lot of coal beds have this strange clay that's, it's a thin clay, and it's claimed to be, what? An ancient soil. Oh, so this is like a swamp soil. But it doesn't match. And it's shameful that they would try to get away with saying that, because there's graded bedding in some of those soils, indicating what? There was sand grains and clay particles that were moving, and they were graded where you got coarse and fine, grading coarse grained on the bottom and grading up to fine in that little underclay deposit. So the clay, the mud that formed that underclay was moving at the time when it was deposited, for sure. Water current is indicated. Some coals have underclays, some have no underclays, some rest upon granite, some rest on other types of rock. You just have coal directly on top of granite. No indication of a soil, no indication of a, this is the best they can claim of an ancient soil zone underneath these coal beds. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Here you got some coals resting on other type. This is resting on limestone here, marine limestone, directly on with no underclay at all. Here's the strange texture of coals. I'm not going to read all this to you, but these are little micro photographs of particles, mudstone particles that are aligned with the current, or not mudstone, but peat, organic pieces of organic matter. This is what coal looks like under a microscope. You can see that kind of stuff. So you got different varieties of coal like that. And so this is a big murder mystery also. How do you get coal beds? And the strange purity of coal, sand, silt, and clay is scarce. You almost find zero in your coal beds, which you wouldn't expect in a swamp. Extraordinary purity. Among the several clay minerals detected in trace amounts only is montmorillonite. Well, what's montmorillonite? That's a type of clay that's usually produced by volcanic eruptions. That gets my attention. Okay, so the idea that coal formed like this, look at this. Kids are fed this kind of stuff, that coal forms like this. Time and pressure produce it. Time never enters the equation. Time is not an agent that does stuff. People want to think time is something that can cause things to happen. It doesn't. Chemistry causes things to happen. Physics causes some stuff to happen. Time is this mysterious agent that does miracles, according to most evolutionists. It doesn't do anything, right? And so when people say, oh, how'd you get here? Oh, I'm scientific, you see. I think we got here by time and chance. Really? Time is not an agent that can cause anything, right? And chance is even worse. Chance is a mathematical abstraction. When people say they got here by time and chance, what are they really saying? They're saying, I'm an idol worshiper. I believe in an agent that has obviously no ability to do anything, but I've got to believe in this because the only alternative is a holy God, and I can't believe in that, right? Because that's too frightful. And it is frightful if you know you're a sinner, right? I know, my conscience reminds me daily. So time never enters the equation. Pressure is not a critical factor. So when it says time and pressure, that's bogus. It's just not true. We know it's not true. Temperature and catalysts, including clay minerals, are key to forming coal. And using heat alone, anthracite-like coal, anthracite is a high-grade coal, anthracite was produced in the laboratory in minutes. You don't need millions of years, you don't need pressure, you need a little temperature, you can cook that stuff. You begin with like peat particles, like tree bark-rich peat. So this is, I'd say, welcome to the most peculiar rock type in existence, and yet it's a major energy source in the world today, coal. What an amazing vegetable particle that is, right? Yeah. Okay, so was it a swamp or was it a floating log mat? Mount St. Helens is the open door for a rational discussion about the origin of a major energy resource. Okay. And by the way, I'll just throw this in just for fun. This is one of my favorite articles. This is the case for, we're talking about oil and gas now. Same kind of thing. You've got organic material that turned into oil and gas. I don't think it happens inorganically. I think it happens from the flood. You got burial of organic material in flood strata, and this guy is in good company. Notice this is 1990, and I'm here to tell you, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a lot of your big oil finders, these really, really great geologists who are discovering these major oil fields in Saudi Arabia and so on, they would say that it's bogus that oil and gas forms slowly and gradually by this process called catagenesis, requires deep burial, millions of years, and all that kind of thing. No, these guys were more open to discussion about this, because the case that oil somehow formed in shallow burial environments and did not require long ages at all was prominent up until recent decades. And then everybody loved the idea of the slow burial, and they had this catagenic model. And I think it's retarded the exploration for oil and gas. That's my opinion. That people, if they thought in a young Earth framework, they would have a better success rate in discovering things like oil and gas. So that's just a fun thing for me. I used to work in the oil, and I worked for 7.5 years in oil exploration before I became a creationist and a Christian. And one more thing, extreme mineral sedimentary particles I've known, all right? And this is I'll be kind of brief here. So I'm trying to expand your understanding of sedimentary particles, right? So mud is the sediment that gets no respect, right? That's what we call it. Children like to play in the mud. Some geologists do, but most people, it's the sediment that gets no respect, right? So you guys remember him? That's when late night TV used to be humorous, right? That guy was funny. Rodney Dangerfield, remember him? Yeah. I get no respect, you know? He's funny. But mud was produced in vast quantities at Mount St. Helens, as I explained. It was not lava or pyroclastic flows that took out 25 bridges, 200 homes, and 185 miles of highway, but it was mud. Torrents of that stuff spilled down the flanks. I already went through this. Objects that don't ordinarily float were carried in mud 50 feet deep, like that boulder, a 35-foot boulder. That's a big rock. It takes a lot of energy to move something like that. Mud can do it. Did you know there's a mud rock revolution? That's right. Sedimentologists playing with laboratory flume models like this. There's a mud rock revolution that happened around the same time as, remember when hydrofracking was a big thing in the oil industry, that got to be popular, right around the turn of the century, 2000, 2005, 10, something like that. And what was that all about? Well, they discovered that in ancient mud rocks, you can, and in flumes, you could reproduce in the flume that sedimentary particles, tiny clay-sized particles, or tiny silt-sized particles, they don't rain down slowly and gradually. Mudstone used to be, the only way to explain it would be to appeal to slow and gradual deposition. And that's the way it stood for many, many years. That's the way I was taught. Only in this century has it been determined that no, mud doesn't behave that way at all. It tends to form floccules, or in other words, it clumps together, and it behaves like coarser sedimentary particles and forms in these angled crossbeds like this. In other words, it's current deposited. In other words, you can build up mud layers fast. You don't need millions of years to do it. And so there's a mud rock revolution that's happened. Mud rocks make up 70% of the sedimentary rock record. Up until 2007, geologists dogmatically taught that mud, silt, and clay-sized sediments require extremely slow rates of settling, implying vast ages for the rock record. That was overturned. Today it is confirmed in lab flumes, experiments, and field evidence that fine sediments like mud can and do accumulate in fast water at rates of centimeters per hour. The whole paradigm was flipped. You don't hear about this, though, do you? The mud rock revolution, who cares about that, right? But it's a quiet revolution that took sedimentology by storm. And the mud rock revolution is greeted with a yawn in the scientific community, but its importance to catastrophist geology can hardly be overstated. And you can, there's a good Is Genesis History program. Steve Austin does one called Understanding the Mud Rock Revolution. It's a good one. So that's a reference for you. So mud madness, yes, we love mud around here. And so we've looked at Mount St. Helens, and we've seen how it's key to understanding vegetable, animal, and mineral particles in the rock record. And we've looked at examples here up and down the sedimentary rock record. I placed the flood, pre-flood boundary there at the Great Unconformity. That's where the flood began, I believe. And then I place it, there's different opinions on this. I place it at the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary up top. But we've looked at ichthyosaurs up at that level, petrified forest, carboniferous coals, Whitmore nautiloid bed. Up and down the sedimentary rock record, we can see evidence of transported extreme particles that were in motion. That's the only way you can explain the rock record. That's what we see in Grand Canyon. So this has challenged the greatest names of science, and I'm here to tell you that is record of the flood. I really believe that, and those sedimentary layers and that boundary there is really, really important to talk about. And what's really cool is you can go down to that boundary and you can put your hand on the boundary in places and say, there's flood strata above and pre-flood rock underneath, and and you're touching history, I believe. My first visit there was I was a student with Steve Austin, and we hiked down there, and we're on a 5-day trip, went down to the bottom of Grand Canyon, and myself and several other students, and Steve Austin, I love talking about him, he's fun. He's actually a funny guy, but he said once when we're standing at the Great Unconformity, that boundary, it's so glaringly obvious, and he put his hand right in the thing, and we're students kind of coming up with, and he says, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. Right? And he said it half humorously, but half truly also. And it was something that kind of made your hair stand on end to think that this could be right here. In fact, I cannot think of a better evidence for the flood than that Great Unconformity. And that was my experience. So when people tell you this kind of stuff, how did those layers get there? And they say gradually, gradually, gradually. Those poor people are beholden to a time scale that's absolutely artificial. Scientists cannot measure the age of rocks. They can interpret a rock's age based on a given set of isotopes and so on, but it depends. It's assumption laden. You have to assume the rate of decay is constant. You have to assume there's no decay at the beginning. You have to assume, and then the rock is umpty millions of years old, you see. No scientist can measure the age of rocks. No scientist can determine the age of the earth. People ask me, how old do I think the earth is? I say, I don't have a scientific means of answering that question. Don't think I have an inside track because I'm a geologist. I don't. I go to a reliable historical account, and there the Bible tells me that you're looking at an earth on the order of thousands of years old, not millions. And I go to this passage again and again and again, that there is a religious motivation for wanting to believe that everything happens slowly and gradually. There's a bias built in to all the scientific community to explain all of the data slowly and gradually. Hey, there's never been any big flood, man. Never been any judgment by God. Come on, put that away. Never been any creation event. No. Peter's words in that passage are the most, to any geologist, they have to be the most profound words in all the Bible, or among the most profound, I guess. But because he predicted this last days, where and he does this in the context of a coming judgment, right? And it's very sobering to think about it. So, what kind of sedimentary particles we talking about? Mineral, animal, vegetable. So those are some of the great sedimentary particles I have known. And so so you think about this, the evidence for a worldwide flood, the evidence of a watery judgment is there in the rock record. And just like it was in the days of Noah, God prepared an ark for people to escape to. There was one door on the side of that ark, and only Noah and his family. What do you think Noah's job description was? His most important job description is given in 2 Peter. It says Noah, or maybe 1 Peter. It says Noah was what? A preacher of righteousness. What was his message? It had to be something like, look, man, God's had it with sin. He's going to judge this world. Your only escape is if you go through this door. That had to be his message, right? What's the message of Jesus Christ in the New Testament? In John chapter 10, what did he say? He says, behold, I am the door. By me, if any shall enter in, he shall find life, go in and out and find pasture. The only way of escape from this crazy, death-cursed world is through the door of Jesus Christ. We enter that door by faith. And so really interesting, I have to wonder if Jesus didn't have the days of Noah in mind when he said that word. Of course, he's talking about the Good Shepherd story there, but I wonder what he meant. And the New Testament's full of that language, isn't it? Either a man is in Christ or he's not in Christ. There's no in between. There's nobody, you cannot say, wait a minute, God, I can be religious for you. Wait a minute, no, you got to enter in that door, man. Because there's a flood coming. Yeah. Okay, so that's, and the good thing is that it's not like Noah was this bearded old guy. You have Jesus who says what? He's inviting you. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn of me, I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. Anybody here need rest? There's rest in Jesus Christ. I found life in Jesus Christ. I didn't have it before. So there you go. See you at the volcano, right? And so please visit us at the Mount St. Helens Creation Center. It is a great watering hole. We get into all this stuff with, I share that message of Noah and Jesus several times a week at the Creation Center. It's really cool. All kinds of people come in there. And so we always need volunteers. So if you're interested in that, let me know. So thank you for your attention today. That's enough of the great sedimentary particles I have known. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Bill.